Hi, my name is Krystian, I'm from TeamworkCast, and let's have a talk about Terminal Directive. At the time of this video, it is the latest big box expansion for Android Netrunner. It is a narrative campaign expansion where your goal is to catch a bioroid murderer. And it seems to be aimed at less competitive players, something you can play with your friend at your kitchen table. There has been a lot of talk about Terminal Directive when it came out, but that discussion has kind of disappeared by now. So I thought it would be a good moment to look back at Terminal Directive, because by now most of us have already played it. We had time to stew in our emotions and form opinions, and I thought by now you could be more critical of that product without fueling the crowd that goes Demon's fault.
Demon Stone is killing Netrunner.
Yeah. Can we have none of this here? That would be so great. My hope is that now is a better time for a more level-headed and productive critique of Terminal Directive. And very obviously we were going to discuss a lot about Terminal Directive itself, so we're going to spoil a lot of things. If you don't want to get Terminal Directive spoiled, then this is now the moment for you to turn off. Although, let's be honest, there's not really much about Terminal Directive that can be spoiled. Wait, was that actually already a spoiler? Part 1, about complexity and choice. So let me address something very important straight away. The campaign can feel very unfair and can be very difficult to play, and that's really unfortunate. I've been following some of the reactions to Terminal Directive, and there have been a lot of reports of really one-sided campaigns. Some people being driven to tears by having to repeatedly play the same frustrating, unfavorable matchup. I've also seen people be really confused by weird and broken interactions, and I've witnessed it myself. Like, for example, in our first playthrough, it was me who ended up winning every single game. And, this really sucked, both for my opponent, but also for me as well. Like, you're not playing the campaign like this only to see your friend lose every time. We were both ready to toss the whole box into the trash. Luckily, we gave the campaign another try, and we ended up having an exciting and close playthrough, as you can see in our videos. But you can also see how many mistakes we still made. We kept constantly forgetting triggers, we opened the wrong box once. At the end we unlocked an ability that basically turned off the ID of the corp. This felt so weird and broken that we are both convinced that we got some of the rules wrong. So we both kind of ignored the ability until we got confirmation from a Reddit post. And we're both seasoned players, imagine what it would feel like for newcomers. So basically there are two issues here. One is a matter of complexity, and the other one is a matter of balance. Talking about complexity, I think Quince from Shut Up and Sit Down identified a core problem quite well in his review. Terminal Directive comes with this little pad that you put stickers on. That pad fills with various triggers and abilities quite quickly. Netrunner by itself is already a game where it's easy to lose track of things. On a regular basis we get really silly unintentional misplays from even the top players. So the pad isn't really just something like a straw that breaks the camel's back. It's more of a straw avalanche that really buries the camel and the entire camel farm with it. Wait, is that even a thing? Is that something like a camel farm even exist? And yeah, I do agree, the pad is a huge problem, and we're gonna get to that more later. But I don't think it's the only problem. You see, one thing that is often requested by new players are suggestions for beginner decks, or teaching decks. And there's various deck lists that people suggest. Personally, I actually really like the FFG demo decks. I think they're actually pretty rare. I got mine from Falco, from some kind of weird back channels. And at first, they seem like a really bad matchup for beginners because it's Jinteki, Kill Jinteki versus Kate. And I do understand why a lot of people shun them. But a person with the username Burr from the Netrunner subreddit once pointed out something which I think is remarkable. The decks are good for newcomers not only because of what they teach, they are good because of what they leave out. Like, there is no meat damage or brain damage, just net damage. There are no traces, there is no program trashing, there is no bad publicity, there are no upgrades, there are no tutors, there are no viruses, there are no bioroids, there are no power counters, there are no recurring credits, there are no tags, except from there, but you can just ignore that. There are no consoles, there are no access replacement effects, there is no ice destruction. And he lists a lot of other things, but all in all, the Netrunner presented by those decks is a lot cleaner and a lot simpler. Yes, there is net damage to worry about, but also there is nothing else but net damage to worry about. What's more, the kind of Netrunner that those decks create is really wild and erratic. The corp relies on crazy bluffs. The runner can instantly just die from a bad decision, but they can also just as easily win. They are quick, simple, high variance decks. And they are well balanced against each other too. The corp is meant to be played by the teacher, so it has a slight handicap, and the runner has all the tools they need to win. So when I use those decks, usually the runner loses the first 2 games rather quickly, but by the 3rd game they have all the traps, and ruses figured out, and they can take home, what feels like a well-earned victory. In short, the demo decks are simple, fun, and good Netrunner. And at its best, Terminal Directive can be that, but at its worst, Terminal Directive is not that. Like, Terminal Directive is playing with a convoluted Magnum Opus MU combo deck against an asset-spammy Glacier fast advance. Terminal Directive is wondering if you can actually add Ines Delgado to your score area if there is no servers with cards to expose. Terminal Directive is having a runner whose ability is to have 2 hands of cards, twice as many to choose from, and weird mulligans. Terminal Directive is arguing with your friend over how many cards you'll actually access from this deep data mining medium dig. Terminal Directive is playing against a fast advance deck without being able to splash Clot. Terminal Directive is not being sure what using an icebreaker actually means. Throughout this video, I will be referencing this one specific talk from the GDC 2017 by Matt Leacock and Rob Davio. They are the designers of Pandemic Legacy, and they talk a little bit about what kind of games are suitable to be turned into like these legacy campaigns. And I think a very important point they mention is that a suitable game has to have a simple core engine.
A simple core engine. Pandemic is a great game, and it actually has a relatively simple core of rules. A lot of people play it who don't play a lot of games. It's cooperative, so you can help each other if someone doesn't get the rules. And as Matt's done a number of expansions that shows that you can build and stretch and move it in different directions, which means as we designed a legacy game, and if it starts with basically Pandemic, we can move it to go to different places with rules, and we knew that would work.
I think if Terminal Directive would have been a lot more like the demo decks, there would have been perhaps even space for a pad full of traditional triggers. I mean, it's not like it's completely unplayable right now, but every now and then the campaign just grinds to a halt. And that would be just mildly annoying if the matchups were always balanced. Which brings me to the other issue. The suggested deck lists in the manual are laughably mismatched. Shaper is completely unprepared against a spammy HB or Scorchy Scorpios. Even with custom decklists, Shaper has an uphill battle against the default HB decklist. And I don't think it had to be this way. It makes you really wonder why we've even given a choice of 2 IDs per faction. There's a really good talk from Lukas Litzinger about some design choices that went into the Netrunner reboot. One thing he comments on is that he really wanted to get rid of the cards that make players roll a die. And his argument is like really interesting. He argues that this is sort of like doubling down on randomness. You draw a card which already is random, and then that card makes you do another thing that is also random. He felt like this wasn't really good design practice.
There's the hidden shuffling, which you don't really want to think about too much, and then there's this dice. It's like, wait, dice? I lost from a dice roll, and maybe I lost because I shuffled my deck wrong? They're like, this game is random, it has no skill, I hate it, I will never play it again. And that's not what I wanted. I wanted people to play it again. So by removing dice from the game, we actually made the game less random, and that rewarded player skill. And that's something I think is very important.
And the most recent game I've worked on has been a really cool combination of cards and dice.
It's all good, baby, it's all good. Nobody's perfect. And I really think you can apply the same kind of thinking to decisions in games. Quite often as designers, we want to improve the choices we give to our players. We want to make them more meaningful. We want to give players more control over their game experience. We want to give them like interactive storytelling. And so we often end up spamming them with those elaborate decision trees. So, in Terminal Directive, you choose runner or corp, and then you choose your ID. And then you make a lot of decisions building your actual deck. And then you decide again between protector and predator ethics. And then underneath all of this is still, all the decisions that you make throughout the game. And sure, that leads to a truly unique campaign experience. But will players even notice it when they play the campaign only once or twice, maybe? Because the flip side is that the game designer needs to create a lot of more content to serve all those different decisions. So the content ends up being spread paper thin. Instead of writing one good story, you end up writing 8 mediocre ones. Instead of playtesting one matchup between 2 decks, you need to playtest 4 matchups between 4 different decks. And this issue will come up again in this video, so I want you to pay attention to all those different moments where a player can easily miss out on some of the best content in the game by making the wrong decisions.
Yeah, and then we stumbled upon what we thought was a pretty clever way of telling a story, and it's that.
Yeah.
And that had a lot of promise in it. And we felt we could do something with that model.
I don't know if anybody's tried that before.
Yeah.
But for now, I think a lot of frustration could have been avoided if instead of the 4 IDs we have right now, the box really just focused on 1 corp and 1 runner. I think we could have had a lot more polished pre-constructed decks. We could have had also a wider card pool for each faction to choose from as players progressed through the campaign and modified their decks. But perhaps most importantly, that would have also fixed a lot of the narrative issues in Terminal Directive. Segue! Part 2, about character motivation. So let's start digging into the narrative. I have one simple issue with the story in Terminal Directive. None of the characters have any skin in the game. Like, there has been a murder, but none of the characters have any good reason to solve the case. Like, there's not much at stake for them if they don't. Bios is kind of like this cyberspace botanist who actually stumbles over some files while tending to her cyber flowers. Steve is the blandest criminal dude bro who finds some files somewhere while hacking NBN. Both seem to pursue the case out of some unspecified curiosity. At any given point, they can just walk away without sacrificing anything. On the runner side, the only character that has a real reason to be there is Ines Delgado. She wants to solve the case because it's her job. It's not the most pressing motivation, but it's a lot better than the 2 runners. So why aren't we just playing her? On the corp side, things seem to look a little better at first. Cider is manufacturing bioroids, so they have a clear interest in covering up any bioroid crimes, so, no problem there. But Scorpius wants to recover the brains of the killer bioroids to boost their drone program? Wow, that's a flimsy excuse for motivation. And I think it really only draws attention to the fact that, frankly, HB should have been the only corp in this story. If there's anybody in the current version of Terminal Directive that has any stake in the story, it's definitely and absolutely Cider. But then, Terminal Directive managed to even undermine that tiny little success. In one of the story packs, we're being told that the corp doesn't actually have an interest in finding out who programmed the bioroids to kill, which makes sense for Scorpios, but makes no sense for HB at all. Like, somebody uses bioroids to kill people, but the company who manufactures those bioroids and sells them doesn't care who? But what's so baffling to me is that this conflict around artificial humans is so core to the world of Android Netrunner. That's why it's called Android Netrunner. So we already have a lot of characters in our roster that would be naturally very motivated to solve a bioroid crime. Like, here's a quiz. You have 3 seconds, name one runner ID that would do a better job at being a Terminal Directive protagonist than Bios or Steve. Go.
3, 2, 1. Too bad, you gotta die. No, wait.
Okay, so I don't know what you picked, but for me, somebody like Edward Kim, the robot racist, would have been a really great choice. Another great choice would have been Adam, like an illegally modified bioroid himself. That would have even added like an additional benefit of Adam, the protagonist, being actually one of the suspects himself. And I'm sure you guys came up with even better ideas. So, it's easy, right? So it's not like FFG, the writers at FFG don't know how to write characters. And sure, it can be like, why do the characters need to be motivated? They're hackers, whatever. And you'd be right, like there is no rules that are being broken by this. A narrative can overcome bland and not very motivated characters, but it has to work so much harder. So with that in mind, let's see how the rest of the story unfolds. Part 3, about the lack of a plot. So initially when I heard about Terminal Directive, the story in Terminal Directive, I was really excited. It paints itself as a kind of like a murder mystery and, it makes sense, of course. Netrunner is already a game of hidden information. The runner tries to expose secrets that the corporation is trying to hide. So like a murder mystery is the perfect match for Android Netrunner. Which is why I was so baffled by the execution. You see, a murder mystery follows like a very specific formula that's kind of very simple and well understood. Like, there is a murderer, there is a victim, there is like multiple suspects, and there's some clues. And then there is like some kind of investigator who finds all the clues, assembles the clues, and finds out who of the suspects turns out to be the murderer. And Terminal Directive has none of these things. Like not even a single one of these things. So there's like multiple murderers, but all of them are just like random bioroids programmed by some kind of mysterious stranger. The number and identity of those bioroids is kept vague, and the puppet master behind all the killings is never actually revealed. The victims are random unspecified people, and their number and identity are also being kept vague. Like I think there's one person whose name is named, but it's just from some random guy who never came up previously.
It's been a long day without you, my friend.
And so I was really surprised when I read the last card in the story and it said the bioroids killed 13 people. Like really? Really? When did that happen? The story never really speaks of suspects either. Like I think on one of the cards of the corporation, at one point they say that it might have been somebody who maybe is from Mars, but it's presented as kind of like an unsubstantiated information and it's never really followed up upon. There's no payoff to all of this. And so the goal of the protagonist seems always to be to find the bioroids, to actually catch the bioroids, rather than finding out who's behind all of the bioroid attacks. And there are never really any clues either. Like the investigation seems to be largely an automated process where the investigators set up some AI-controlled information filters on the internet and wait for the results to come in. Terminal Directive is a story where nothing really happens. Like there is no plot to speak of. You set out to catch a murder bioroid and then you just do it. And then that's it, and then you solve the mystery. Yay! And you could argue that it's unfair to apply this specific murder mystery formula. Crime fiction as a genre has like so many subgenres, and they work a little bit differently. So, for example, Blade Runner, which, seems to be very much the inspiration for Terminal Directive, doesn't really have suspects either. And that's true, but only like to some extent, I feel. Like, for example, Blade Runner, the protagonist Deckard is still busy, running down clues, examining evidence, interrogating people, actively seeking out information that would help him finding out the whereabouts of his targets. So of course the formula can play out differently and you can leave out some of the elements, but if you leave out everything, you really no longer have a functional story. And I feel like this ties back to a problem that I've heard repeated over and over again, like multiple reviewers commented on how the story cards in the game were too long. Like you have those story cards that you read in between games that explain what is happening. And I argue that the problem is not that they are too long, the problem is that the writing is really just all fluff. Most of the time Terminal Directive is busy pretending there is something meaningful going on, where in reality it's really just wasting your time. If the story cards actually contained meaningful information, I don't think we would get tired of them. And I can't stress enough how it's especially the lack of victims and the lack of a murderer that is really hurting this story. A well-fleshed out victim would have been a great opportunity to establish, like, for example, a motivation for the protagonists.
Bye, old man.
What if the victim is a relative of Steve, or at least a relative of Ines? What if it's a person from the Netrunner universe that maybe the players care about? What if it's Cathy Jones, or what if it's Princess Space Kitten, or Mr. Cell Phones? Some of those cards are about to rotate out, and I think it would have been a really great opportunity to give those characters like a story arc, a reason to rotate out. And how do you actually fail to have a murderer in your murder mystery? How can you not have that Scooby-Doo unmasking moment, where it's like, Akitaro Watanabe! And I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you, meddling kids. Man, Rogue Jinteki says, "Up trying to frame HB." That's actually a good story. But I also like somebody from Mars being the culprit. I think that would have been also a really great opportunity to tie the red sand cycle into the story. And I'm quite baffled by this, but come to think of it, it's not really like a unique problem with Netrunner. That's something I've seen with other FFG stories before. For example, for months and months now, we've been playing this huge Imperial Assault campaign, and I cannot even remember one of the stories behind the missions we did. But that's okay, because the actual missions are quite memorable and quite vibrant. So perhaps the intention was to use the actual games of Netrunner to tell the story of the investigation. So let us take a closer look at how Terminal Directive is using the actual games of Netrunner as storytelling devices. Part 4, the big one, where we talk about how the game tells a story. Okay, so this is going to be the long one. One of the reasons why I fell in love in the first place with Netrunner is how every match of Netrunner tells a story. The cards in Netrunner are these narrative building blocks that often assemble those fantastic cyberpunk stories. And of course, this happens on the level of individual cards. For example, Cathy Jones is this smuggler that exchanges favors with the runner. Or Jackson Howard is this corrupt J.F. Sebastian-like creative guy that the Corp mines for ideas, but then at any given point they are just as likely to fire him and replace him with reruns of old successes. And then there's even more interesting storytelling happening when multiple cards work together. For example, when a runner uses Account Siphon to steal money from the corporation, but then that lets them find out where he lives, which lets them attack people he's close to, trashing his connections, or they simply burn his house down with a boom. Unless, of course, he maybe has a crash space to hide at, or a sports hopper so he can stay ahead of the corporation's assassins. One of my favorite pieces of storytelling in Netrunner is Adam. Adam is like this sentient rogue bioroid. He starts with 3 directives in play, and they're kind of inspired by the 3 laws of robotics by Asimov. The directives are kind of programming that gives him some advantages, but also makes him predictable and restricted. And the Corp can exploit this programming. So Adam is giving all these tools to deal with the programming. And it's really up to the player to figure out what Adam does. He can, for example, gradually and brutally destroy his shackles and essentially become a human-like character, essentially like the Pinocchio story. Or he can contact unsavory characters to maybe temporarily disable unwanted directives but keep others, kind of like a compromise. Or he can embrace the directives and overcome his apparent weaknesses by playing into the strengths they provide. And each Adam deck, each match with Adam tells its own story, its own version of Adam's story. In every case, it's the players who are in charge of crafting these stories. And in every case, the stories are told using the actual cards. There's no narrative interludes needed. I really love how Adam and his cards can tell these stories, and I'm really missing this kind of storytelling in Terminal Directive. And this is a complex topic, but for the sake of this video, I wanted to look at Terminal Directive storytelling through 3 different lenses. The first lens is what I would call representation, which elements of the story are actually expressed by cards or other in-game pieces. To some extent, for us players, elements of the Android universe that are not represented by cards actually don't really exist. So think of how Adam's directives actually exist in the game as individual cards. It may seem obvious, but I think this little fact provides very important groundwork for any future further storytelling efforts. The second lens is about acting. what tools are players given to act out the story? When we talk about interactive storytelling, we often think of like these sprawling decision trees I mentioned earlier. But I think it's often more useful to think of them as theater. Think of players being the actors in a play. So it's not so much about changing the play, but living it out, expressing your role in it. To come back to our Adam example, Adam can use cards like independent thinking or Dr. Lovegood to interact with his directives. Also, the Corp can exploit the downsides of Adam's directives to catch Adam maybe in some kind of nasty trap. Adam has to run every turn, so they can maybe put up spiky eyes everywhere. Those examples are all like different ways for players to act out Adam's story. So what I want to look at is what tools and abilities are players given to act out the story of Terminal Directive in the game. Finally, the last lens is about the theme. A lot of the time I think storytelling in card games doesn't have to be very precise. As long as the overall theme is on point, the players can use their own imagination to fill in the gaps. So for example, think of how all the big box expansions introduced new themes and expanded on existing ones for the various factions. Order and Chaos introduced a very strong theme of spaceflight into Wayland. You got like Gagarin, you got a space camp, you got satellites, you even got space ice. Honor and Profit expanded upon existing themes for criminals, for example, by bringing in more shady characters, cunning schemes, and even like a friggin' gun. And you know, quick aside, I think the most successful application of this principle so far really was the Sansan cycle. This was the first time when not only the entire cycle had a theme, but also each individual data packs had their own tiny little theme. For example, Breaker Bay was about a university, or Chrome City was about cybernetics, or Old Hollywood was about those senses. I think this was one of the instances where FFG really knocked it out of the park, so I was hoping for something similar in a kind of like a narrative expansion like Terminal Directive. So let's start out with representation. Which elements of the story are actually represented by cards? Off the bat, I'm seeing a lot of missed opportunities. Like the list is very short, it's just Inés Delgado, Officer Frank, Evidence Collection, and Laguna Velasco. Depending on what choices you make, you can also get Lieutenant Todeshin and The Mask, but they are more like rewards than actual characters that carry the story. So really, when it comes down to characters, it's really just Inés and Frank. And don't get me wrong, Inés is great. It was one of the characters I really enjoyed, and it was a great pleasure having her in the game. Frank is also cool, but I didn't put her in my deck, so she never made an appearance. And come to think of it, she actually doesn't show up on the suggested deck list in the Terminal Directive manual, so what happened there? But also there are just so much more characters in the story cards that don't even get that chance. For example, on the runner side, there is like Mick, the dorky drone and AI guy, Officer Greer, the helpful street cop, and of course Proxy, your AI secretary. On the corp side, there is Sloan, your chief of security, Dax and Pteri, the trolling IT twins, Zhang, your legal advisor, Lopez, the network security chief, Kiranova, the chief of R&D, I think, your snark AI secretary, and a bunch of more. Not to mention the actual killer Bioroids and the victims, of course. None of these characters are even present in the game in any way. The events of the investigation are also barely represented. The Corp gets to score like some anonymous 3-2 agenda called Evidence Collection. It's really a bland, generic agenda that conveys little of what the actual evidence is. It could be for any crime, really, and narratively, it doesn't even change over the course of the game, even though you put so many stickers onto it. I do really appreciate that Laguna Velasco, the scene of one of the murders, actually made it into a game as a resource. That's the kind of storytelling we're looking for, and I think there just could have been a lot more of it. So for example, the story mentions this Gandhi gun, which is some kind of tricked out stun gun that can be used against Bioroids. So I wonder, why aren't we getting this gun as hardware? Because instead we're getting like this weird BMI buffer that is never mentioned in the story and has nothing to do with the story itself. Also, the box comes with a bunch of cards that depict characters like Estelle Moon, Mason Bellamy, Mr. Stone, KP Lynn, Dean Lister, Maxwell James, and so forth. And you know, why aren't those characters in an actual story? Why are all the cards over here telling their own story with their own cast of characters, while the campaign is over here telling their own story with a completely different cast of characters. So let's move on to the second lens about how the game allows players to act out the story. And things look a little bit brighter here. So there's this core interaction that progresses the story from the runner's side, and that is stealing information from the corp and giving it to Ines. And this is accomplished by the runner having to install Ines and then scoring an agenda, which also adds Ines into the scoring area. The idea is that you keep her in the loop as you investigate. And that's a fine interaction, even though some of her additional effects are kind of like all over the place. Like sometimes she exposes a card, sometimes she looks at cards from top of R&D. It really looks like as if they selected those randomly. And another thing that bugs me is that you can progress the story even if the agenda you steal actually has nothing to do with the investigation. I guess that hostile takeover was the missing piece to catch a murder Bioroid? From this point of view, the evidence collection agenda is actually even better. It's bland, but at least the corp is allowed to, actually investigate by advancing it. I really like that. I just wish maybe there was some more interaction with this agenda and the runner, like maybe if the runner got something special if they intercepted it. But this is just bread and butter. Things get really interesting when the corp also gets Ines Delgado as an asset. Ines Delgado is unique, so the runner's Ines gets also trashed when the corp presses their Ines. And I really like this interaction. It depicts Ines as this kind of like opportunistic double agent that is willing to play both sides if it helps her achieve her goals. And it's even better that Ines as an asset can swap scored agendas. So as a corp, you can potentially steal evidence collection from the runner's score area. I really, really like this. And the only thing that bums me out is that it's so easily to miss. Like the corp can choose to get Lieutenant Todeshin instead, who is pretty irrelevant to the story. Or they can choose Ines, but just never add her to the deck because it's never necessary. And both of these things happen in our playthroughs, which makes me wonder, why isn't Ines a mandatory asset if it makes the storytelling so much better? One way of acting out a story that I think was really successful were the warnings. Basically, both the runner and the corp can unlock those special stickers called warnings. When they trigger the condition on those stickers, they immediately open up a new pack. The packs contained usually bad cards that had to be added to the deck, and sometimes it was immediately, like in the middle of a game. For example, the runner would realize that they are being followed by this shadow team, so they had to add those resources to their deck that would auto-install when they draw into it. And when installed, the shadow team would make runs like harder. But it could be also removed by making a run on a central server, essentially losing your tail. In addition, you could also permanently remove all of these copies of Shadow Team by stealing 2 agendas in one turn. The other warnings were not quite as flavorful, but still surprising and fun. It was perhaps the most memorable moment of our playthrough to me. It felt like the campaign has really invaded our game and made us play out a certain story. But even then, I think the warnings could still be a little bit improved. Like one of the things I found disappointing is that some of the warnings could be easily avoided all the way through the entire campaign. Even if you trigger them, some of the effects of the warnings were a bit too easy to overcome. Like we played through the campaign twice and we never saw Trojan in action because it was always removed before anybody could even draw into it. Which means again, you could easily miss out on one of the best parts of the campaign. Also, I find it weird that the effects were something that you would bring onto yourself. If the runner is followed by corporate goons, why isn't, the corp involved in that, It seems like it would make more sense if the Shadow Team warning was something that could be triggered by the corp rather than the runner. So even though a lot of the elements of the story aren't really represented, players are at least given ways to act out certain narratives. However, there's one core issue that all these great interactions have. They have all fairly little to do with the story of investigating a Bioroid murder. As great as Shadow Team is, it really has nothing to do with Bioroids. It's just some generic corp goons that show up. It could be any cyberpunk story. Same for Ines or evidence collection. They would all just as well work if the story was about, drug smuggling or corporate espionage or a kidnapping or any other crime. They are all really great activities, but they're just really hollow and really isolated from the overarching story. I think that problem becomes more evident if you look at the tasks. So players are constantly unlocking those stickers called tasks, and they're basically side quests. Each task is introduced by a small narrative blurb, but all each task does is to give those benign and disappointing in-game boosts, like when you have 3 or more programs installed, gain 6 credits, close this file. Like, why is a whole sticker printed for something this inconsequential? And what does this all have to do with the story of the Bayreuth murder? And just like the tasks, none of your other actions ever feed back into the story. Shaking your shadow team won't get you closer to the Bayreuth killer. You don't even learn who sent them or what they wanted to find out. Sure, scoring evidence collection will progress the story, but only in a way that doesn't reflect what actually happened in the game. So yeah, there are good interactions in the game. I just wish they were better integrated with the overall narrative. Finally, let's look at the theme of Terminal Directive. And here again, I see like a lot of missed opportunities. The story of Terminal Directive is the story about this like police investigation, corporate cover-up, espionage, a murder, there's a murder Bayreuth, this kind of stuff. So, let's take a look at the cards in the box, which ones depict something that would be part of this type of story. Evidence collection certainly looks the part, and maybe Maxwell James, he seems like some kind of covert informant, and some of the HB cards show vaguely ominous Bayreuth technology like brain rewiring or elective upgrades. Successful field test is really neat because it shows like a Bayreuth investigator who, ironically, is never really featured in the story. But really there's not a lot here. Instead what we get is a lot of stuff that seems out of place. Like, what even is Honey Farm? And why is an illegal arms factory involved? Like, that seems like some whole other criminal case of a very different type. And what even is illicit sales? Man. Even the cards that do tie into the story seem to have the wrong vibe. Like, Officer Frank just doesn't look like a cop at all. She looks like some kind of entomology professor. Laguna Velasco is not depicted like the scene of a brutal murder either. We already know the design team at FFG can do a lot better. We already have a ton of cards that would fit perfectly into a theme like this. So we have Domestic Sleepers, Awakening Center, Project Wotan, Unregistered Swiss & Wesson, NAPD Contract, Fall Guy, Compromised Employee, Frame Job, Invasion of Privacy, The Cleaners, Raymond Flint, Witness Tampering, Breaking News, Cyber Threat, Manhunt, Snatch and Grab, Housekeeping, CBI Raid. Look, I could go on and on. I think you get my point by now. But just in case, here's a different way of looking at this. This is a story about a police investigation, and out of over 60 cards, only 3, maybe 4, feature cops or any kind of police work. So these were my 3 lenses. I want to wrap up with some armchair game design, and so here are 2 examples on how to tell the Terminal Directive story using the game. I have a small example and a bigger example. First, the small example. Imagine there was a pack called Open if the runner is flatlined by meat damage. The pack contains the instruction: the runner must add one of these cards to their deck. They begin each game with this card installed. And the next few cards is just a series of cybernetics. Finally, the last card is a story card. The runner talks to the owner of a chrome parlor while they have a medical procedure done. Apparently some Bayreuth came in the other day to get something fixed. It was covered in blood. The chrome parlor guy gives you a serial number. This is something that could have been easily integrated into the current campaign structure, and it's good because it reacts to what actually happened in the game, and it also uses cards as a storytelling device. And finally, it's thematically on point. It's kind of like maybe reminiscent of the scene in Blade Runner, when they go to the store, the shady store where they're selling eyeballs. And it's kind of also nice and poetic when the investigator investigating the Bayreuth murder actually turns into a robot himself slowly.
But Major Kusanagi's body was also made by Megatech. And not only the Majors. Parts of me and Ishikawa and Saito, we've all got to have regular cybernetic maintenance.
Anyway, here's the big example, and that example would actually require you to reinvent the entire campaign structure from scratch. So imagine if the entire campaign worked differently. At the beginning, the Corp has to put 3 Bayreuths in their deck. They could be all variations on Adonis campaign, some kind of economical card. And then the Corp begins with those Bayreuths installed. The Corp is also given maybe some kind of like product recall operation that removes Bayreuths from the game. At some point, the runner unlocks a special scanner hardware that can download the memories of those bioroids. The task for the runner then becomes to access the bioroids in the corpse deck so they can scan them with a scanner. The corpse task then is to prevent this by protecting them with ice or whatever until they can be removed from the game. Every time a runner scans one of the bioroids, they open a pack containing hints on which of the bioroids is the killer. In later games, the runner can attempt to capture the bioroids they suspect to be the killer by equipping a Gandhi gun hardware mentioned in the story. However, the corp can also attempt to score a special agenda, maybe called product retirement, that permanently destroys a bioroid line. If any of those effects hits the actual killer bioroid, it goes berserk. It gets a sticker that turns it from a benign asset into a trap asset that also triggers if the corp draws into it. It also shuffles itself back into the deck so you can never actually get rid of it. So both the corp and the runner then have to fulfill some tricky condition to permanently disable it. Whoever does this first wins the campaign. And this is good because instead of reading about how you're actually trying to catch a bioroid, you actually do it in the game. All of the elements of the story exist as cards, and players can act out the story using the different cards and abilities given to them. And finally, everything is thematically integrated. The corp tries to discreetly bring a defective product under control, while the runner tries to blow this whole thing wide open. Now, granted, this is armchair game design, so this is a very complex sequence of events. You'd have to go through a very long process of playtesting and adjustment to make sure everything is fair and balanced and actually works. There's a lot of questions that are not answered here. And there's a good chance that some of the ideas actually turn out to be impractical to implement. But my problem with Terminal Directive is that I'm missing similar attempts to actually convey the story of a bioroid murder mystery using the actual game of Android Netrunner. Part 5, where we speculate. So I'm gonna do something now which I really don't like, which is I'm gonna take a small intermission by speculating a little bit about the reasons of why Terminal Directive turned out this way. And the reason why I don't like doing this is because, frankly, it's none of my business and I have no idea about how FFG works. So, all of this is just idle speculation, and quite often these turn out to be way off the mark. But also I feel like I have to do this because I have been quite critical of the box. And online, this kind of criticism can be taken too far very easily. There is a tendency among gaming communities to take any kind of flaws in the games that they enjoy to be taken as very personal. And quite often people pick out individual developers and blame them for being stupid or incompetent or lazy, or they pick out the publishers and they call them greedy or something like this. So to avoid really people walking away with these kinds of impressions, I wanted to propose a couple of scenarios that would explain why a game like Terminal Directives wouldn't end up being this way. To me, it seems like the different parts of Terminal Directive have been designed to be modular on purpose. We talked about how the different characters don't really seem to have any motivation to solve the crime, or how the events of the story could fit any type of criminal investigation, or how the story cards are avoiding discussing specific plot details. This suggests to me that Terminal Directive either changed dramatically throughout the development, or that the different parts of it were actually designed at different times. Imagine if Terminal Directive used to be intended as a regular big box expansion, so they already started designing and playtesting all the IDs and all the cards, but then somebody decided that they should turn it into a narrative campaign. Or imagine the campaign used to be a lot more elaborate, but then the budget was slashed, or people had to be moved to different teams, or they just couldn't make it work. So late in the development, they had to redo the entire campaign from scratch, and so there was just no time left to make the story cards, and the campaign mechanics really meshed together. Which, by the way, would also explain the hilarious size of the box. Stuff like this happens in game development all the time. And I think as players, it's easy for us to forget that no game developer ever wants to release a weak product on purpose. Most of the time, the games we get are the result of really well-meaning developers trying to make the best possible product under very specific circumstances. And we as players, we just never know about those circumstances. I just wanted to add this bit to remind everybody that these games are made by actual people who mean well. So please be civil when discussing these things. And I'm looking at you, comment section. Part 6, about how new content is tied to winning. So let's move on to something different and a lot more specific. As mentioned in the beginning, Terminal Directive has a lot of potential to feel unfair. One aspect of the campaign structure that adds insult to injury is that new content is almost exclusively tied to winning. So if you win, you get all the toys, and when you lose, you get nothing. This can lead quickly to situations where players feel locked out. And this, in turn, spoils the fun for the winners too. All the toys don't mean anything if I don't get to share it with my friends. And if that wasn't enough, the packs don't only contain bits of the story, they also contain various rewards like cards and task stickers. Those can potentially give the player who opened the pack an additional edge over the other. That's what we call a positive feedback loop. The winner keeps winning while the loser keeps losing. Now, the way to deal with positive feedback loops is to introduce some kind of compensation mechanism. And I think it's interesting to look at other campaigns to see how they manage this specific issue. For example, Pandemic Legacy has 2 separate mechanisms to balance the campaign, and one is a very systemic approach. That's something that Terminal Directive doesn't have. In Pandemic, you have these yellow cards that really help you winning games. But every time you win a game, you have to remove 2 of the cards from the game for the next match. But every time you lose a game, you add 2 of the cards back in. So this is a kind of a dynamic handicap that automatically adjusts to your skill level and makes sure that the game is always interesting. The second mechanism is a kind of security net that triggers when you lose too many games. And I don't know what it is, but apparently there's a special pack that you open when you lose too many games. And Terminal Directive does have such a mechanism. It is pack 9. If a player loses 4 games, they have to open pack 9. This pack contains cards that are supposed to help the losing player turn the tables. However, while correct in principle, the mechanism is somewhat flawed. Corp's Pack 9 is good. It provides a corp with this single-use agendas called Corporate Oversight, and I really like this pack because the effect is incredibly strong and simple and can be easily exploited to almost guarantee wins. But also, the agendas are destroyed after use, so the effect doesn't really stick around. So it provides a very powerful, but also temporary boost to the losing player. The Runner's Pack number 9? It's not that great. It's called Sneak Door Prime, a large, expensive program that can convert runs on certain servers into runs on another server. Okay, I think I need to clarify this. So there's 2 versions of this program, and depending on your ethics, you get one version or the other. So the Predator version turns runs on a central server into a run on a remote, and the Protector version turns a run on a remote into a run on a central server. And there really is no way around this, but both versions suck. The Protector version can be a surprise if the corp is relying on unprotected remotes, but eventually it can be easily played around. Because it can be used with events, the damage you can do on centrals is limited anyway. And even if you install something like Medium, at 2 clicks per run, your digs won't be that deep anyway. The Predator version is really only successful against a rushing corp. Most other corps will either fast advance or secure their centrals before they create a scoring remote. Overall, Sneak Door Prime is expensive, large, slow, and it can be played around rather easily. But maybe that's on purpose, because, it could be so much worse. This is not a single use like Corporate Oversight. So if it actually was effective, it would never go away and would provide a permanent boost in the runner's favor. On paper, Pack 9 is a good mechanism, it just doesn't quite do its job, at least on the runner's side. And additionally, I also miss a second mechanism like the one in Pandemic Legacy, where it's this systemic approach to making sure that the game keeps self-balancing as you play through it. But ultimately the real issue is that it's more of a crutch, and a real solution would address the problem at its core. Why are the rewards so one-sided? Why is it even possible for players to progress their story without affecting the other side? Wouldn't a lot of these issues be solved if, as a rule, every time you open a pack, both sides get something? Take the example above with the cybernetics pack. You open it when the runner lost, so I guess the corp progresses their campaign. But also, to compensate, the runner also learns something and also gets some new toys. Because in the end, as a game designer, you cannot actually guarantee a fair game. There will always be bad card choices. There will always be an unfavorable matchup. There will always be, just like an imbalance of skill. And yes, in the end, there can always be just like a streak of really bad luck. Something you can focus on and you can try to guarantee is that both players are having fun in the process. If one player is going to lose, at least make them lose in a fun and engaging way. Part 7. About those legacy mechanics. So finally, let's get to the legacy part. So Terminal Directive uses something we call legacy mechanics. They are a bit of a new hot thing in board games right now, and they refer to games like Risk Legacy or Pandemic Legacy. Risk Legacy was the first game of this type. It's kind of like a regular old game of Risk at its core, but to spice it up, players are asked to go through a campaign of dozens of matches. During this campaign, various effects trigger that allow players to make permanent changes to the game. For example, this player can place stickers on the board to permanently change the world of their game, or they are prompted to destroy components, like tear hated cards into pieces and so forth. But at the same time, it fits perfectly the theme of a game depicting a global military conflict, like, as the war wages on, it leaves permanent scars on our planet. The blurbs on the boxes say things like, what's done cannot be undone, and that's because the decisions seem to have more gravitas if they have the potential to change the actual game forever. Another blurb says, make it yours, and that's because at the end of the campaign, players will have their own unique version of the game at hand, a version that has soaked up and recorded all of the dramatic events of their many play sessions. There are even nice stylistic ways in which players can customize their experience. For example, players can give names to new cities in certain circumstances. Terminal Directive follows this trend by also trying to adapt those legacy mechanics, but for the game of Netrunner. And it sounds great on paper, and like so many, I was really excited when the details of the campaign were first released. But now after playing it, I'm actually starting to question the usefulness of those legacy mechanics for card games. You see, card games like Netrunner are already by their nature customizable. Like, we are already making it yours all the time. It's almost like the entire point. Like the term CCG stands for collectible card game, but also customizable card game. One of the innovations when Magic was released back in the 90s was that players could build their own decks. Netrunner is no different in this regard. Opening packs with new content inside sounds amazing and exciting for a static board game, but for Netrunner it happens constantly already. Like, our game changes permanently on a regular basis, once a month when we get our data packs. And then we use the cards we get in those packs to build our own custom decks. So in this regard, the legacy mechanics don't really change a lot about how Netrunner already works. Like, imagine if the Terminal Directive campaign was just a straight campaign that had no new packs to open. You'd still have this custom playthrough experience because all of the deck building that you would be doing. So customization isn't really new to Netrunner. What about the irreversibility part, the what's done cannot be undone part? Well, here, the FFG designers seem to be trapped kind of like between a rock and a hard place. Destroying or defacing precious game materials is radical and a big draw of the legacy mechanics, but on the other hand, irreversibility makes the box less viable for competitive play. Like, if you start putting stickers on the cards or tearing the cards apart, you can't use those cards in tournaments. So you can either have a straight competitive tournament viable box with no irreversible legacy mechanics, like all our previous big boxes were, or you can have a full radical balls-to-the-wall legacy box that is going to be useless confetti at the end of the campaign. Or you can have something which I think is the worst of both worlds, which is kind of like a tepid compromise, which sadly is what I think the Terminal Directive legacy mechanics are. So we're gonna give you a bunch of stickers, and you can put those stickers onto things, but you can only put them on this worthless, meaningless sheet of paper, which nobody cares about. And you can't put them on the cards themselves. Well, okay, you can put them on some cards, but only on those 2 cards. And you know what you can do with this card? Yeah, you can just take this card and rip it into pieces. Yes, but only this card, not the other ones. Because, that would be too crazy. Now, that doesn't really feel so radical now, does it? Like, it kind of feels like going to a rock concert in a high visibility jacket while your mom is watching out. But that wouldn't be such a bad thing if all those stickers at least did something interesting. And they just don't. Most of the time it's just really mindless, busy work, like accounting, but with stickers. Look, you put a total of 3 stickers on your evidence collection, but all they do is to update which pack to open to progress the campaign. Like, they don't really change anything about the card itself. Except, of course, for the last sticker, which seems to be so embarrassed by the pointlessness of this exercise that it throws in like a random ability, almost like an excuse. On the other hand, it's not all bad. Like, for example, I really love corporate oversight. I like the idea that you have to rip the card into pieces when you win using it. I feel like that's a really fine implementation of the legacy mechanics. It really feels meaningful to destroy a card that just helps you win. Ripping Shadow Team into pieces was nice too, because it felt a little bit like revenge, although Shadow Team was not enough of a pain for it to really feel satisfying. But at least I can see some potential here. So I do think it might be worth applying legacy mechanics, but I also feel the campaign would need to lean more into it. They would need to be applied on things that the players actually care about, like cards that make a big difference in the game, or cards that the player care about from a narrative point of view, like shred this account siphon, turn that astroscript into 5/3. So here's an example. Remember how previously we were discussing how the story doesn't really have any victims, so the players aren't really emotionally invested? So imagine if the runner starts with a bunch of connections in their deck. Imagine those connections are maybe actually copies of well-known connections from data packs, like Cathy Jones, or Mr. Lee, or John Masnori, or Mr. Cellphones, cards that are just about to rotate out. Uh-oh. Imagine if throughout the campaign, the Bayreuth murderer actually kills those connections, so you open a story pack and it tells you to rip our beloved Cathy Jones into pieces. Perhaps even mid-game. Now that would be a cool way to apply legacy mechanics and also make the player invest emotionally in the story. But of course there is an issue here, because for something like this to work, a much larger percentage of the box would need to be committed to cards which aren't tournament worthy. Will the competitive players even care about a box full of copies of cards which they already own, or cards which they cannot play in a tournament anyway? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I feel like this is a decision that the team at FFG eventually has to make, because it could be a vital decision for the future of Netrunner. Part 8, about the future of Netrunner. Okay, so Terminal Directive has some flaws. It gets some things right, it gets other things wrong. Oh well, we had other packs in the past which were weak, why do we even care? Well, it's because I think Android Netrunner needs to urgently grow a casual scene. I was really excited for Terminal Directive because it seems to be doing exactly that. Before Terminal Directive, all a newcomer could do after a core set is to grit their teeth and basically drink from the fire hose of over 1,000 new cards to get their collections up to a competitive level. And even then they would get rewarded by having to invest even more, having to keep themselves up to date on a highly competitive tournament scene. Like, don't get me wrong, I love it, but I also see it as a huge barrier of entry for a lot of people. And it only gets bigger as more cards are being released. I know a lot of Netrunner curious people who just aren't that interested in that kind of competitive scene, not for that price anyway. And since there's no alternative, there is really no place for those people in Netrunner at all. There is no gradual curve that connects the core set at the kitchen table newbies to the competitive top. There is only some kind of like awkward, rocky cliff. This is something that a Netrunner can be really jealous of when looking over at Magic. There's just so many ways to play Magic, like the barrier of entry is so low. You can grab a cool dual deck and play that right away, and if you like that, new ones are constantly being released. They have these cheap booster draft tournaments that don't even require you to own any cards. They have newcomer-friendly base sets that contain simpler cards. There are like more janky casual formats like Commander, where you can goof around with the silliest cards in your collection. But of course, Magic is a very different game from Netrunner. It's a CCG, not an LCG. So we cannot just look at what they're doing and copy their stuff. We have to reinvent the wheel for ourselves. We have to create our own casual spaces. And to me, Terminal Directive was an attempt to get started, to create a space for newcomers to exist beyond the core set, without immediately gunning for the tournaments. I would have really loved to have a box I can recommend to people as a follow-up to the core set. And maybe I'm wrong, but Terminal Directive is just not that box. It seems convoluted and complicated. It seems like, unfocused and half-assed. and I feel it really has the potential to put people off Netrunner forever. So now I would probably still recommend people to get creation control as the next box after the core set. It just seems such a more safer way to go. To me, this really needed to be a home run, and it's just not. Okay, so where do we go from here? I think we still need that follow-up to the core set. We still need to build those casual spaces, because this cliff will still keep newcomers out of the game, which has the potential to eventually choke out the community. So I may have sounded really negative throughout this video, but I really hope that FFG won't give up on this idea of a narrative campaign. I still think the overall concept is sound. I think a lot of useful lessons can be drawn to create better, more successful follow-ups, and a lot of the weaknesses I've discussed here are things that, the team at FFG already excelled at in the past. But I would also suggest that for a follow-up to be successful, it needs to be more committed to the idea of casual play. If you try to satisfy everybody, you often end up satisfying no one. And you know what? That kind of commitment will always take guts. It's always easy and safe to appeal to an established audience, rather to establish a new one. And I really hope that the team at FFG will take this kind of leap of faith. After all, we're all here because of their incredible work so far. And hey, maybe there's another way. Maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong. Maybe we need to think outside of the big box. How about just polished, casual-oriented duel decks? Or a whole cycle of shorter narrative missions like in Arkham Horror? And of course, there's a lot we can do as players in our communities to be more welcoming to newcomers. So for example, some people were inspired by Thermal Directive to create their own campaigns. Or I've seen initiatives to kind of fix Thermal Directive with suggested deck lists and added rule sets. So let's start the discussion on how we can create those casual spaces in Netrunner. What can we do? What can we do for people after the core set? Feel free to share your ideas in the comment section. Let me know what you think. And thank you for sticking with me for such a long time. I know it's been a long one. As always, hack the planet.
Hack the planet! Hack the planet!
Shut up and get in the car!
Shit on me.